Welcome, dear viewers, to a new episode of Dialogue Horizon. In this episode, we will continue on the issue, the most important issue now, which concerns everybody in Sudan, in the globe, is the economic issue and the deliverance of Sudan from its present economic deterioration. That's why I'm continuing in this episode, last three episodes, to ask and to interview and to host economists. This time we have our economist, Abdulrahim Jamal Sabra. He is economist and he is the managing director of Yellow Agency, which is concerned and works in the management consultancy, market access, and connection with those who are firms, big firms. It's a consultancy firm. It's something new that gives help to those who want to enter the market of the country and to those who want advice on the economic problem and situation. All this kind of services is rendered by the agency of our friend Abdulrahim Jamal Sabra. Welcome, Abdulrahim Jamal Sabra, on this episode, which will be primarily on the economic conditions and the ways how to circumvent any possible collapse in the whole system. So, welcome.
Thank you, Engineer Umar. It's always a pleasure to be back on the show and to discuss the current economic situations in Sudan.
Okay. Abdulrahim Sabra, being as an economist and being in the United States for quite a long time, you spent a good big time, although you are from the residence, the old residence of Omdurman, the big city, the national city of the country, Omdurman. But you spent quite a good time in the States and you had your education and studies all in the States, United States, so you will be fully aware of the American strategies and the American ways of how to give helping hands and when and how. So anyhow, so I want you first to give me your evaluation. After 2 years now, since the compliance of Sudan with the International Bank and Monetary Fund, which started long time ago, but now the World Bank and the IMF are convinced and the international community is convinced. That's why they started going very fast positive results, which was one of it is the lifting of the sanctions, of the American sanctions, and accepting Sudan back on board on the IMF and the global monetary system, which started doing some good because Sudan complied with the most important and difficult issues of the recipe. First is the current value. They want the international community, as you know, they want the real value of the national currency. They don't want any other figures which will mask the real value. This number one, this was done, and it did some good effect. You can tell us about it on the value of the Sudanese pound and its comparison to the dollar. The second is the lifting of subsidies. Both are difficult, especially lifting of subsidies. They have hard impact and social impact. That's why many governments in different parts of the world, they couldn't comply fully with the recipe because they are afraid of the political upheaval due to the mass reaction. So can you tell us about your feeling after the application of this recipe of the IMF?
Okay. First, to begin off, we could safely say that the last 2 years have been very difficult. And a lot of the things that were accomplished, they had a lot of lead time leading to an actual event like lifting of the sanctions or liberalization of the Sudanese pound, lifting of the subsidies. All of this took time. It was certainly of great help that the international community had initially admired or fell in love with the revolution of the Sudanese people in many aspects. This opened the door so that Sudan can be reinstated back into the international community and receive help and support in order to come out of the economic crisis. Unfortunately, like I said, all of these things happened with a lot of lead time because it requires a lot of processes, a lot of paperwork, a lot of confirmation to the international community in order to achieve those things. The point that we're in now is after we have gained a lot of momentum, achieved a lot of aspects, it's suddenly now been cut off. And we're now in a gray area where the international community is watching to see if the path to democracy would actually be achieved, the new Sudan would actually be achieved, or we will be stuck in some sort of unknown state, and even, God forbid, to something similar to what we were in for the past 30 years. So to completely answer your question, I think it would be best to get things rolling, to reaffirm the trust to the international community so that we can regain momentum and work on aspects that would put us in the right path to recovering or having economic reform in Sudan.
And what about the social effect and the impact on the people and the economy? Do you think that the government succeeded in appeasing people and people that is there any compensation for this, especially for lifting subsidies? Everything, the prices went high, all commodities, especially fuel. But people are now fuel is available. The stations, the fuel stations are no lines anymore. So how did it happen? All of a sudden, this big jump on the prices. Do you think that people? What made them? Is there any adjustment to the price, to the salaries or the revenues of the people? What happened actually? It's really amazing. Something weird.
Yes, I think in terms of the economic state, it is definitely deteriorating. To begin, I would believe that all of these things that happened, they knew they were bound to happen. If you lift subsidies, if you liberate the exchange rate, definitely it was going to be a hard course or a hard path to go down. The government was probably under a lot of pressure, and they decided to do these different reforms at the point where they had no other option. We've seen that previous governments have tried to do similar reforms in different states or in different contexts, and the outcome was always something that was very difficult for the country to endure. It put countries in economic recession, especially for Sudan, given its history. The only different aspect socially, like you said, this time around is that there was a unanimous consensus from the population that it's going to be difficult, but we're going to try to put it or put through it in order to give this government a chance, which was the transitional government. I can imagine that a lot of programs that were made to support this phase, such as the family support program, was made so that it can reduce some of the burden on the Sudanese population. We've seen firsthand that it cannot be considered a successful program to 100%, but they did try to do their part. Prices are still soaring high. Availability is because when something goes up so high, demand diminishes. So we cannot justify that it's available as a rational success factor to increasing prices. We can rationalize that lifting subsidies was a right step in order to stop the smuggling of goods out of Sudan and to concentrate on economic reform, which is the path that we have to take.
So yes, having said the smuggling of goods, we mainly like the fuel flour, sugar. These are the three items which were subsidized by the government and paid a lot of dear money by the government, because as I read or saw in one of the statistics that Sudan imports fuel, gas, cooking gas, and flour and sugar at almost double or triple the actual need of the country, because that part goes smuggled to eight neighboring countries, very poor, and they have difficulties in different aspects around sharing the borders with Sudan. So this in the long run, I think, do you think that it will help, because it will reduce to some extent the deficit between import and export, because now people, they will start actually paying for the actual need of the Sudanese people inside the country, not for others, 7 or 6 countries around us who don't have the money to import, and they depend completely on our products which crosses the border illegally. Do you think this is something good also in the long run?
Definitely in the long run, lifting subsidies, liberalization of the exchange rate, these are all good aspects that you would need in any functioning economy. Unfortunately, under our circumstances, we already knew that it was going to be difficult for the country. And I believe a lot of the programs and the support from the international community was made so that it would reduce this burden in the short term, relieving subsidies, liberating exchange rate, to somehow be compensated by direct injections to low-income families, such as the family support program. As mentioned earlier, the success rate for this program, given that the population of Sudan is mainly in the unbanked sector, the actual dissemination of these funds would be difficult to implement, or a lot of aspects that would probably still play a major role in relieving the burden from the population and being a crucial success factor for the current state. To add injury to insult, this momentum, these plans were all put in place beginning from when we had Ibrahim al-Badawi as a minister, and to be implemented. A lot of things were delayed because they were not politically accepted, or that it was politically dangerous to lift subsidies, even though it was inevitable. After the implementation of a lot of these aspects, which we've seen now, take a lot of time, almost toward the end of the transition period, the result was something we could not avoid, but maybe the delay added injury to insult, and it made things a lot worse. To add, Sudan is in a very difficult situation. It would need additional support from neighboring countries or from the Friends of Sudan countries conference in order to allow it to withstand this phase until we reach an equilibrium in terms of prices, until we our exchange rate, until the deficit is closed. It's definitely going to be a bumpy ride. It's not going to be something easy, given that the country is in a detrimental economic state. And just lifting the subsidies, there were a lot of reports from UN agencies such as the UNICEF that the below poverty population would increase by 1 million. So there was a lot of difficult factors to consider, but it had to be done.
Okay, Abdurrahim, as an economist, I have something in mind which is really something amazing and weird. People, many governments, very strong governments, they refrain from complying with IMF, and because of especially subsidies, because they are afraid of the public revolt and taking to the streets, and so that's why they prefer to pay hard currency to import goods at subsidized prices to the. But what is really amazing in this revolution, after the revolution and after the implementation of the lifting of subsidies, people did not take to the street calling for the high prices. They just very sensitive going to the streets on the slogans of freedom, peace, freedom, and this is the slogan. So people, it seems that people do think that they prefer this slogan of freedom to because they did not take to the street until this moment talking about the prices. So this is a good indication that the government can go all the way implementing the IMF and the world international system, monetary system, that we can go all the way till, because my question is linked to another question which you can answer both of them, that in different countries it didn't work and people are afraid, especially in Africa. Most of the countries which applied or started applying the IMF recipe, the hard recipe, they stood short of completing it and they aborted the thing. So it did not help most of the African countries, like, for example, say Zimbabwe, like different African countries like Sudan. Do you think, is there any place or any where this recipe work well, or what are the prerequisites for the recipe, which I'm sure it is something scientific done through hard work till they came to this recipe? Do you think some prerequisites are required for a country to successfully apply the recipe to the end?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. I believe first we have to consider Sudan's history with the IMF and the World Bank. If we look at the past few governments that were overthrown, they were overthrown due to reforms that at the time governments were trying to make. If we look at 77, Nimeri's government entered into economic reform following IMF and World Bank recipes, and it took the country to economic turmoil or collapse, which led to him being overthrown in '85. Again, the late Sadiq al-Mahdi also tried to implement reforms which brought about him being overthrown from the previous Salvation government led by Omar al-Bashir. So we don't have a pleasant experience in Sudan in following these reforms or recipes from the IMF and the World Bank, partially probably for several reasons. One would be that the context in which these reforms are implemented is very difficult, so a country would need to tailor or to implement the reforms in different contexts. Secondly, we'd probably require additional support. We've seen Egypt recently when they went under economic reform. They've had a lot of injections from countries in order to help them during their process, which turned out successful to a certain extent. And unfortunately, we don't have the same privilege here in Sudan, or we haven't had it yet, because we don't have reserves in order to back up the liberalization. And as long as we need certain aspects to make these recipes work or to place them in our context, we would need additional support in order to make it successful. If we look at another neighboring country like Ethiopia, they rejected the IMF and the World Bank recommendations when especially they needed funds for the Renaissance Dam. After successfully gathering funds on own, then Ethiopia went to the negotiating table with the IMF and the World Bank, and they got them to agree on the financing, but with different contexts that Ethiopia felt was appropriate for them at the time. So it would be very difficult to implement the recipe as is and have successful outcome, without additional aspects or additional support, or without tailoring to the specific conditions of the country.
Of each country, yes. So this takes me back to what you said. You mentioned that about Salvation, the hostage regime. what the hostage regime tried, as you know, started by late Hamdi. He started the first one to start the free market economy, policies of the economy, which resulted in some difficulties, and some people are still not happy. But why do you think, why the salvation? Why the salvation under the sanctions? Since 1993 and 1997, they survived this till 2011, before the. So can you compare? Now I consider this in the new government, the revolution government, I consider it as a success. As far as, to some extent, considering the whole situation, we consider it as a success, and it went peacefully and smoothly till this moment. As I told, nobody took to the street to revolt against the high skyrocketing prices. People, they write in the newspaper, they write in the media, social media, but nobody dared to go to the street. Although there is freedom, they could have done it. But why the salvation, the hostage regime, why did it first survived all these sanctions, but all of a sudden they started the downfall after the secession of the South in 2011. So just give us in brief a comparison between the success, I consider it a success, and the failure of the hostage regime to fully comply with the IMF, or fully to prop the economy, especially after the secession of the South. The economy needed some prop to be propped up, but the salvation couldn't, and it was one of the main reasons which led to the downfall of the regime. What can you tell us in this aspect, this comparison?
If we look at the salvation regime, I believe the oil was their main support. It accounted for about 80% of the revenue generated for Sudan, and for a long time they depended on oil in order to subsidize fuel, to subsidize different commodities, and to make sure that living conditions were kept at a certain rate for the general population. So they used this income to achieve political stability. Only after the secession of the South in 2011 were they not able to do so anymore, because they had lost most of the revenue
75%.
that had supported them for the previous 14 or 15 years prior to that. This government, as mentioned earlier, did not have the same cushion or privilege ever since they came in power. Sudan is greatly in debt. Economic conditions were very deteriorating and still are, and they didn't have anywhere funds for additional support. Had the Salvation Army, the Salvation Government made these reforms prior to the secession, we would definitely be in a better state now, because they would have had the means and the power to support the different stages of the reform. But unfortunately, by the time they realized that this needed to be done was in 2018, I think, and it was too late to politically try to implement these reforms, and this probably led to the overthrowing of Umar al-Bashir, or the Salvation regime. Now this current government has had, like you said, popularity or consensus among the general population that people were willing to endure conditions that they could not accept under the previous regime. This was the cost of getting rid of a dictatorship to a certain extent, and this is probably why the general population still accepts the hardship that it's in now as something they have to pay off in order to achieve democracy.
Yeah, that's good. So that you think this is the difference, the big difference, that people at that time, after the secession of the South, as if you are saying, after the secession of the South and the government, the hostage government, the Salvation regime went almost bankrupt when they lost 75% of the oil proceeds. So at that time, people were, the anger of people was swelling because of, not only this, because of the freedom. They don't have freedom. Peace was not there. No agreement in peace. War, full-fledged war in the Darfur and war in the Blue Nile, and at the same time no freedom and corruption. So all these factors led to the downfall, the quick downfall. So I agree with you that without the cushion which they had since the export of oil before the cessation, they could have, but at the same time, at that time, if they stopped the subsidies and they started to implement the real recipe, because they have the money at that, they don't need the cushion. Now, as if you are saying that the recipe of the IMF and the World Bank is okay, but it needs support, starting cushion. Without this cushion, so people will be in deep trouble. That's why it failed in different countries. Okay, now we go to another question which is also important and related to the subject. The spokesman of the Minister of State of America, after the last agreement between Prime Minister Hamdouk and General Burhan on the known as the political agreement or political declaration, whatever it is, anyhow, they said also the Americans they said it's okay. They commended what happened, but they are still waiting to see more from the partnership there that will give the indication that things are stable. So that's why still the suspension of the $700 million of America is still going on. So do you think that if it is averted, I mean, if they allow the 700 and the flow of the assistance, they pledged many assistance in different aspects, and the World Bank continued. So do you think if they go back to the situation before the 25th of October, do you think there will be no effect of the temporary suspension of all these assistance?
Okay, to efficiently answer this question, first we have to state that it was not just the 700 million from USAID that was suspended, it was also funds from the EU, UK, a lot of different programs or funds that were allocated to Sudan were just about to come in or had just started to come in. The state that we're currently in has again put us in a situation where the international community is very hesitant to see how things will turn out in order for their pledged support to be implemented. All of these countries had pledged this support in order to support the civilian-led transitional government and the democratic process that were supposed to be achieved. The tricky question now is how fast will this be reinstated? How fast can the government reestablish the trust with the Americans or the international community in order for these different funds, different programs to be reinstated? If it's a 3 to 6 months thing, then there's no biggie or no long-term effect. If this process to reestablish trust and certainty again for the international community is something that will take another 2 years like it did before since the beginning of this transition, then yes, we'll be greatly affected until it is reinstated, or the support will be prolonged, the effect, the results would be prolonged now because it will have a later starting date. So this will all depend on how fast we can get things back on track and to reestablish the international community to regain the momentum.
So you think, which I agree with you, but as an economist you have a better vision. So you think that any delay more than, say, 3 months without convincing the international community and America and European countries that things are back to normal on the track of freedom, peace, and transition to democracy. That's what they need, are the prerequisites they need. So as if you are saying that if this is reassured within, say, 3 months, there will be no big deal. It can only be resumed immediately. But if it takes longer, so it will be because it takes time for this to reopen the funds. So the sooner the better, you are saying.
Yes, I would completely agree, because most of these funds are not direct deposits received by the general population or by institution. They are actually programs which are funded by, let's say, the USAID. So these programs will depend on, trickle-down economics, where things are actually implemented on the ground, and the benefit is then trickle down from company to end users, to contractors, subcontractors, freelancers. So it will depend on actual execution in order for us to reap the benefit. The longer this is prolonged for the process to start, the longer it will take for these benefits to be reaped.
To be reaped again, okay. Okay, something related to this, and your agency now is, you are working hard in giving help as consultant to in the market access and in different aspects, and to different companies, maybe foreign companies. So do you think, when will the atmosphere be very conducive so that your company will flourish by newcomers from big investors asking for to invest? At what time? What is the conditions or the atmosphere which will be very conducive to these people to come voluntarily to join, because they want to make money? Actually, they know that Sudan is rich of resources, so they want to make money. But what other things which keeps them skeptical about entering the market? Because now you are in the marketing business.
Yeah, definitely any investors, local or international, they would initially be looking for stability. Sudan, to a certain extent, had achieved some sort of stability in terms of exchange rate liberalization or politics in the previous period, to a certain extent. Given that everyone's ambition was that this was a momentum that would keep on going until there is some sort of stability. All of these programs or these funds internationally were designed so that they would be another aspect which would benefit this stability, or to add to the stability of the economy. Now, like I've said, that we are again in a gray area. First, we must reestablish again the trust internally and with the international community, and we must see progress again from the different aspects of the government, reaffirming this stability, reaffirming economic reform, so that foreign direct investment can be possible. Without this confirmation or the trust being won again, everyone will be reluctant to invest in the country. They will be reluctant to even allocate resources to Sudan, whether it's internal or external, if we cannot have some sort of stability in the coming period.
So it's the pathway, let us say, or the key point is stability first, because people look for stability. Then later they look for infrastructure, for laws governing the flow of cash and money and things. This comes, but first stability. This is the first threshold. If Sudan does not qualify itself that this threshold is easy, accessible, nobody will come to invest his money in the country. So stability, political stability, I think. When you see political stability, is now, as we see, we cannot claim at this moment we are talking together, we cannot claim stability. Nobody knows what will happen tomorrow, actually. So that's why companies, different investors from outside, they will not be. But do you think that if things, let us assume that things became stable, governance is stable, democracy transition is going to transition. Do you expect that big multinational companies will come to invest in Sudan, or does Sudan have the resources, attractive resource which will make big multinational companies to come to Sudan to invest in different fields in agriculture, industry, in adding value to some of the minerals like this? Do you think we have the potential for that?
We definitely have the potential in terms of resources. All companies are looking to make money. All investors are looking to gain profits. So we can definitely agree that Sudan has a lot of potential in terms of investment. Do I think these big companies will be coming? I believe a lot of the companies, especially in the field of agriculture or animal resources, were very closely watching progress in Sudan for the past couple of years. And like you mentioned, during this time, there has been a lot of changes in terms of laws, in terms of environments, to make it cohesive for investments or welcoming to investors, local and international. We've seen investors from neighboring countries take risks in investing in Sudan, but it is very difficult to say that we are truly open for business if we cannot achieve political stability. And I think all these multinational firms would probably be very reluctant to invest in Sudan if they cannot have assurances and reach some level of certainty that it's safe to invest in Sudan in terms of politics, in terms of benefits. The exchange rate is stable to a certain extent, like you mentioned. Infrastructure is there. There are no major burdens to the business, such as the port being closed without any.
The banking system is not still up to.
Banking system. All of these aspects, they have to be progressing to a certain level, and they have to be assurances to the international community in order for foreign direct investments to coming. We can definitely say that we were on the right track in the last couple of years, and the momentum was just beginning to reach, let's say, a level that we were all ambitious or hoping for. But now we're at a stage where it's slowed down, stopped. It's a gray area. This has to be reinstated, and it will take time again to reach the same momentum so that we're back on track.
Oh. So this needs, anyhow, what's good in what you said is that Sudan is really inviting. It is good of its resources. It has resources, potential resources that can attract, to the extent that it can attract multinational big companies. But the homework from our side, locally, we have to do enough so that people, investors, big investors, can come to reap and to share with us the benefit of the resources after being processed. Or okay, let us go to another totally different issue. I want you to tell me about a very controversial issue. Sometimes a little bit sensitive, but it is controversial here in Sudan, about the military economic section business. All people, they talk, even the Prime Minister Hamdouk mentioned in one of his statements that the military economic, let's say, section or part of the economy, they almost have work and activities in almost all fields of the economy, so that they can do something in the short term. And what about the long term? Okay, in the short term, I mean, let us say if they agree to give a helping hand, just something, not. But what your views, frankly, on this controversial issue? How can we go about it? Bearing in mind, if you compare it with what is happening in Egypt, which also they have the military, they have intervention, big role in the economy of the country. But the economy of Egypt is definitely very wide and diversified.
Okay. If we look at this issue in two aspects, one is the political aspect about the acceptance of military complex as a business. Then there's the economic aspect, that the actual revenues, the benefits reaped from these businesses should be owned by the public sector, or they should be supporting the public sector. If we just consider the economic aspect, this will have a lot of questions to be answered. The current need is to close the deficit in order to, like I mentioned earlier, to reach some sort of equilibrium and availability for exchange rate, which would be the stepping stone for providing a cohesive environment for investment or economic reform. If the military complex is willing to close this gap, in the short term, this would be definitely a benefit to the country.
By doing what? By paying money or contributing on the deficit by in the short term. What can they do in the short term? Because the Prime Minister mentioned that something like this. Hamdok said the military complex will. In the short term, you mean paying?
Maybe it's paying for the deficit. All of the proceeds are deposited into the Ministry of Finance in order to close the deficits.
Okay.
It could be paying their fair share of taxes. Okay. Because a lot of government entities might not be paying their share of taxes. And in the short term, it would be definitely a solution to the problem. I imagine, though, that the Ministry of Finance or the government would want a long-term solution, even if they accept a short-term support from the military complex. Long-term, it would be very difficult to justify a parallel business like this proceeding that might be engaging in, let's say, unfair competition, which will again provide economic imbalances in the country and making it very difficult for the private sector to compete or to operate in the same industries that this complex operate in. So short term, it might be beneficial. Long term, I believe there has to be a lot of aspects which need to be considered to ensure that these complexes are operating without damaging the economy, or they are part of the public sector.
Part of the public sector.
Yeah.
Okay, what about the Egyptians? They are there for quite a long time, not for almost more than 50 years. The military complexes they have their role, but I don't know exactly the relation between the government, the civilian government, and the military. What is the economic relation between them? But what you are suggesting that for the short term, okay, it will be good that they help in bridging the gap or adding to the relief of the deficit. That's okay. But in the long term, you said it is not logical that two parallel systems in one country, they cannot go together because maybe there would be unfair competition, or they be so. What are you suggesting that how can we definitely cannot call it off completely and close the military complex? Maybe can we restrict the activities in certain areas or some involvement of the government? What you have in mind about this?
There would definitely be a lot of conditions to consider, like you mentioned. If we look at Egypt, you also mentioned that Egypt is a very vast economy compared to Sudan. The military complex operates in different fields, mainly construction, because the country is engaged in huge infrastructure projects. So they are basically serving themselves. But how much of this complex is competing with the private sector in meat exports or in agriculture? This we'd probably have to consider, because the initial issue now is that not that the military complex is the main company providing services to the public sector. It's that they would compete in an unfair manner against the private sector in most of the viable industries in Sudan now, including livestock, agriculture, mining. So it's very difficult to have a fully operating market if there's going to be competition and unfortunately, sometimes unfair competition from publicly owned companies, if we consider that this is currently a publicly owned company.
So this reminds me of something very important, that they could what they can do is to give certain areas field. It is illogical. You cannot accept the military complex to work on meat processing or meat export, or they should concentrate on industry, maybe, because industry is wide and is still virgin, the industry in Sudan. A lot of fields can be, so they can be directed to go for the industry, which is a big process, not like going into selling or processing the meat and selling. This is where the unfair competition will be there. So I think it is good that they put some areas, restricted areas, like this is restricted areas too. Like the military, they have restricted areas also. The civilians, they have restricted areas in business. Okay, Abdul Rahim, still we have few minutes, but let us go to two important things very quickly, because I think we have about 5 minutes. One is about the budget. People are very afraid, skeptical, those, especially those who are not economists. They say that there are only 35 days left for the turn of the year. And till now, this moment, budget is not yet drafted or not yet passed at any stage. So will this be something dangerous, something bad, something detrimental to the future of the coming year about the budget? Or the budget is something easy, can be done? Now we have only 35 days.
Again, this is probably a difficult question to answer without having inside information from the Ministry of Finance or the individuals responsible for the budget. But I imagine that all the budgets would probably have been done, even the most recent, would be a 3-year budget or a rolling budget, rolling forecasts. And definitely the reforms that were in place had projections. These projections were probably not very short term. They were at least 1 year projections, 2-3 years projections from the Ministry of Finance. All of these aspects now need to be reconsidered in the new budget, but it would definitely have a lot of uncertainties given the current situations, because even the projections that were in place are now very difficult to say that they were close to reality that was imagined at the time, given the current economic and political situation. So yes, a lot of uncertainties, but it's still doable if the different factors are in place, and the Ministry of Finance would be the most party that would know all the different aspects that be considered in the budget.
Okay, another in 2 minutes. We have only 2 minutes. The important question, the last question about the committee. There's a lot of controversy and talk about the committee of the relieving the empowerment and the corruption of the old regime. This committee, it is confiscated, and some of the firms of people, and they have money and they have assets. So will this add positively to the economy of the country?
Again, this is a very difficult question, because there's different aspects, short-term and long-term. If we look at the main function of the committee, on a short-term basis, they confiscated, let's say, real estate, they confiscated businesses or actual funds in the banks. All of this on a short-term basis, it is not of benefit to the economy, because they would actually slow down the progress or the cycle in the economy if you confiscate money, if you confiscate businesses and you stop them from operating. And real estate essentially has no value to the economy if it's not a money-generating vehicle. On the long-term basis, if they can be of benefit to the economy, will also depend on how they went about in these different aspects. If this money confiscated was reinvested, if these businesses that were confiscated were actually operated properly to keep contributing to the economy, or they sold them off to the private sector and they still contribute to the economy before they actually don't exist, or they don't have any knowledge in the type of business. So it will depend a lot on how they operate these different aspects within the committee, to see if this effect on a long-term basis would be beneficial. On a short-term basis, like I said, I believe that it would actually not be of impact to the economy, at least not in a positive matter.
In the short run. But in the long run, this confiscated, let us say, firm factories, are there going to be private sector or government or whatever? What do you expect that to be of benefit to the country in the long term? How can we operate the confiscated businesses?
Like I said, if it comes to real estate, are they generating money, or will they be sold off and generate money for the economy? If it comes to different businesses, then are these businesses operating? Are they contributing to the economy, or are they just confiscated and shut down and no effect or no positive effect on the economy anymore?
Okay. Thank you, dear Abdul Rahim Jamal Sabra, for being with us in the last hour, and I think we spent good time. We touched some good and some difficult issues. Thank you, dear viewers, for being with us in the last 50 or 1 hour with our host, guest, Abdul Rahim Jamal Sabra, economist and in the business consultancy. Thank you. Hope to see you next week on a different issue. Bye.